PowerPoint to get through it faster, and I've also scripted it completely, so I can't possibly slow down and waste time. I know you all want to get home, folks, so a couple of just a couple of clarifications at first. I've tried to keep this a little bit light, but also keep the messages in here as well, because this is meant to be concluding, but also think about futurism, singularity and that sort of thing. You think, yeah, it's all science fiction. So I presume that's why they got a science fiction author in here. I mean, well, engineer by day, science fiction after hours. So I've tried to make this entertaining as well as have a reasonable message. So who better to entertain you with than a reading from, not Sean McMullen, but Terry Pratchett. And this is from Guards, his 1995 novel, which he dedicated to those brave and heroic men who rush in around about chapter 3 and get slaughtered by the heroes. In this particular case, the guards saved the city from the dragon and rewarded by a small pay rise. And just after they saved the city from the dragon, Lord Vetinari is speaking to the commander of the guards. And we have a very interesting lesson in terms of the nature of good and evil in this passage that Lord Vetinari tells us, which I want you to remember all the way through this talk, because I'm going to come back to it at the end. It's an extremely important one. This is Lord Vetinari speaking. He's the guy who runs the city, talking to the captain of the guards, who's a very good man. And Lord Vetinari is a bit like Machiavelli and Goth Black. Let me give you some advice. It may help you to make sense of the world. I believe that you find life such a problem because you think that there are good people and there are bad people. You're wrong, of course. There are only, always, and never were, bad people. But some of them are on opposite sides. A great roiling sea of evil, shallower in some places, but deeper, oh so very much deeper in others. But people like you try to put together little rafts of rules and vaguely good intentions and say that this is the opposite, that this will triumph in the end. It's amazing. Down there are people who will follow any dragon, worship any god, ignore any iniquity, all out of a kind of humdrum badness. Not really high creative loathsomeness of the great sinners, but a sort of mass-produced darkness of the soul. They accept evil not because they say yes, but because they don't say no. I'm sorry if this offends you, Captain, but you fellows really do need us. Yes, sir. Oh yes, we're the only ones who can make things work. You see, the only thing you good people are good at doing is overthrowing the bad people. The trouble is, it's the only thing you're good at. One day it's ringing the bells and celebrating the overthrow of the tyrant. The next, it's everybody sitting around and complaining that the garbage hasn't been taken out. Because bad people know how to plan, you see. Every evil tyrant has to rule the world. The good people just don't seem to have the knack. But do you really believe that's all there is, sir? About all this endless evil and sheer blackness? It's the only logical conclusion. But how do you get out of bed each morning? I do. What's your point? I'd just like to know why, sir. Oh, do go away, Captain Vimes. There's a good fellow. Okay, now, one of these characters has a huge but discreet fan club, primarily of educated, professional women. Which do you think it is? Of course it's Lord Vetinari. He's a bad boy. People like a bad boy. And what is one of the most popular characters? I went to Terry Pratchett's conference in Sydney back in April. You'd be surprised how many Lord Vetinaris there were. The guys like him too, they just don't join the fan club. They dress up as Lord Vetinari if they've got the figure for it. Okay, why? Why is the suave Machiavellian bad boy so popular? If humanity is only a century or so away from the singularity, we actually need to deal with this exact question. It's extremely important, and think about this as I proceed. Okay, there's a few issues that are specific to science fiction and transhumanism that need to be clarified right now. Firstly, we authors are concerned with entertainment and sales as much as we are with predicting the future. Why are there so few novels on climate change? That's because publishers have the idea that it's a bit depressing and people don't want to read about it. So the authors tend not to write about climate change. Secondly, if you write a good enough scenario, people will want to build your scenario in the real world. Now, think back to 1984 when William Gibson, 1983, when Neuromancer was published by William Gibson. Everybody wanted to build the online wired hacker world. And by hell, in 1994, when the web came along, they could do it, and they fell on it. And Gibson was basically the god of the hackers for years. 1984 is the opposite. People found that really quite loathsome, and 1984 really never happened. The catch cry was, it's going to be a 1984 world. Oh, we better not do that. Okay. So more importantly still, while researchers and engineers and activists will point out the benefits and the pitfalls of a new technology, it's the science fiction authors who actually show you how it feels to be living with that technology, because they tend to take fairly normal people like all of you and say, here is the world, here's the situation, what do you think of living in this situation? That's our stock and trade. Okay, so themes in science fiction parallel those of real world science. There are examples of people making of making people more like machines, and that is bionics and cyber augmentation. Of making machines more like people, and that's AI, robotics, and putting people into machines. That's virtual environments. Human-machine chimeras, however you pronounce that. Then there's sculpting people to be greatly improved on the original design, and that's genetic engineering and cyber avatars. And constructing machines that could reproduce themselves. That's replicators, and we had one sitting just here, which is very opposite. This leads to speculation about whether or not machines will become autonomous and dominate the future, or whether humans will enhance themselves so much that they'll maintain their current dominance, or whether there'll be a type of symbiosis. And remember, the topic of this is doing it now. So this is a very important question for us. Regardless of what happens in science fiction, however, we have some evidence that really serious change is not far off. And it's actually lack of evidence. For several decades now, we've been searching the radio signatures in the skies for extraterrestrial civilization, and we have found nothing whatsoever. It's totally silent out there, apart from background noise and stars and things. So the implication is that civilizations such as ours evolved to a very different set of values, technologies, needs and practices after just 2 or 3 centuries of industrialization. So there's a very brief radio blip, and then everything goes very quiet. What does the silence mean? Have they just gone all fibre optic and tight beam, so they just don't broadcast Star Trek to the entire universe? Or is there something else? Have they transcended into beings that don't require that sort of communication? I incline to the latter theory, and this means, of course they can have wars as well, but you'll probably see very brief flashes as well, which we haven't been seeing. I incline to the latter theory, and this means that we shall go seriously transhuman, probably before the millennium's over, and possibly even before the century's over. History shows us that we have the tools already. Okay, and let's go into a historical parallel just to, this is basically, I thought there might have been a few more of the inventors around here by now, but I'll take a little parallel. The steam engine. When did we start using them to do real constructive work? I ask this question when I do school talks, and sir, Stephenson's rocket. Well, wrong. The first locomotive was built by Richard Trevithick in 1804. That's 25 years before there were railway engines. Stephenson came to it quite late. But Trevithick had a steam car going 3 years before that, in 1801. Okay, well, that's a little bit earlier. So when was the first steam vehicle? Was that his car? Oh no, it wasn't. The American inventor John Fitch demonstrated a steam boat in 1787, and they started running them commercially well before the 19th century started. But there were steam engines before this. Some of the brighter kids in the class will say, what about James Watt? Well, yes, there were mine pumps to pump water out of mines. Quite a few people, are aware of James Watt, but even that's wrong, because he actually improved on the steam engine. I remember being taught, oh yes, he was watching the kettle on the stove and the lid came up or something. Wrong. Because Thomas Newcomb was producing commercial steam engines from 1715 or something like that, about roughly 50 years before Watt supposedly saw his kettle on the stove. And if they weren't practical, people wouldn't have been buying them, because there was an awful lot of Newcomb engines being used all through the 18th as opposed to the 19th century. But he wasn't the first. And notice I haven't even said which is the first steam vehicle to carry passengers. It's 1707. French engineering genius Denis Papin, inventor of the pressure cooker, by the way, demonstrated a steam-powered boat. And apparently the local boatmen thought it was such a threat that they actually destroyed it. And he never went on to do a better pressure cooker or whatever he did. But he was the first to apply the steam piston and various things like that. So, first steam vehicle was in operation 122 years before popular conception. But this is still not the end of the story. Geronimo Beaumont patented a steam pump for getting water out of mines in 1606, another century earlier on. Go back to 1400, and during the 100 Years' War, the English were using a steam bellows called a suffolator to actually stoke up fires that were being made of wet wood. It's very depressing when your army can't get a fire going in the evening because it's been raining all day. Okay, that's still not the beginning of the practical use of steam. Notice I say practical. William of Malmesbury chronicles a steam-powered organ in use in Reims in 1125, and this is a practical working steam steam machine, a steam device, that was working before Richard the Lionheart was born. Okay, so 19th century steam, steampunk and all that sort of thing. Okay, we've gone back nearly 1,000 years and we still haven't seen the end. Now, the more knowledgeable of you will say, I'm now going to mention Heron of Alexandria with his little steam turbine. Yeah, it was good, it was a workable toy. But it actually wasn't the first, and it certainly wasn't the first thing to move under its own power under steam, because an unknown inventor actually had steam-powered birds. You'd heat them up over a fire on a string, then you'd tie them and they'd sort of fly around in a circle. They were actually using like a steam-powered rocket bird, and this is about 50 years before Heron of Alexandria. Okay, if you want to go back to the earliest mentions of steam, they go back to Cedios of Alexandria in 250 BC, who was experimenting with, like, as far as I can tell, a sort of a solar-powered piston thing. The records are a bit unclear, and I don't, read classical Greek. So. But the point is, we've now gone back over 2,000 years, and this stuff was around the whole time. Okay, so steam power goes back that far. Now compare it to the current situation with transhumanism and singularities. Some toys, lab experiments and arcane machines that currently exist will almost certainly be the foundation of technology, society and economy of the future. And this is somewhere from about a century to maybe 1,000 years. Quantum computing, entanglement communications, and virtual reality are probably the three top candidates that I can think of. There are dozens more. Certainly the Greeks and the Romans had the metalworking skills to build practical steam engines. And were it not for the abundance of slaves and the cultural outlook they had, railways might have been unifying the Roman Empire, and Roman steamships might have actually discovered Australia and America quite a lot longer than the other Europeans discovered them. Now the same is true for human flight. I could actually write quite extensively on medieval aviators. Astronomy. Who was the first person who discovered gravitation? Well, it wasn't Newton. There were theories of it in medieval times. First law of motion is identifiable in medieval manuscripts. theories that the marks on the moon were mountains, that the Milky Way are made of stars, long before Galileo. Gunpowder weapons the same, submarines the same, and even manned rockets. I mean, apart from the apocryphal story about the Chinese guy who blew himself up. In 1913, an American stuntman strapped himself onto a huge rocket and thought to have a short flight. The rocket blew up on the launch pad, and he lived, actually, surprisingly, but that was about 47 years before Gagarin, so, you know. Technology can be around very, very, very early, long before the really popular usage. So a lot of what we saw today, a lot of what's out there, is actually the foundations of the future already. Okay, so what form will transhuman transition take? Okay, enhanced intelligence. I've heard a lot about that so far this weekend, and it's generally thought of being the engine driving transhumanism. There is no more worthy thing than having more intelligence, but for a start, it's not unique to humans. And there are lateral methods, niches for survival and even for flourishing. Apart from that, cephalopods, that are octopi, squid, can demonstrate degrees of intelligent problem solving, tool use and observational response behaviour comparable to that of a chimpanzee. Yet their brain weight is considerably lower. I believe their neuron count's about the same as a dog. But remember that the octopus evolved in the Carboniferous era about 350 million years ago, and they developed the brains of roughly the size they've got today around about the time the dinosaurs went extinct. Okay, now this is quite important because they use the brains differently, they're wired more efficiently in a certain sense. So was there an octopus, trans-octopus singularity back 65 million years ago? Could we as humans actually recognise a singularity like that have actually taken place? Because it's so different to what we've got and to what we look upon as important. Sitting around in a room with nice furniture and that sort of thing. An octopus has quite a different set of values, one presumes. And what we see these days is actually what's left over after the singularity. The octopi have gone their own way, or they've got a octopus collective mind or something like that. I mean, once again, you're starting to get into mysticism things now, but if they've got something that we can't comprehend, doesn't mean it hasn't happened. Okay, birds evolved in the Cretaceous era, while their big bad relations, the dinosaurs, were still sort of thumping around. The wild New Caledonian crow can not only use tools, it can actually manufacture tools for specific problems. Which is, I've seen the videos, it's just, that bird's doing that. That's just flown out of the jungle and is doing that. That can't be right, they must have trained it, but apparently not. The African grey parrot, Irene Pepperberg's experiments with Alex, I think its name was, actually displayed a convincing degree of comprehension in its use of human words. Ravens, wild ravens, lure wolves when they discover a carcass to tear the carcass apart so that they can actually feed on the scraps after the wolves have finished with it. So they're actually almost farming. They're using other animals as tools. Compared to humans, these birds have very small brains, yet they're apparently wired considerably better than our brains, and they're certainly exhibiting an even higher level of applied intelligence than any ape. So did they have a bird plus singularity, or are they just sort of limited by their size? Okay, so using tools, speaking, managing other animals and solving problems is all very politically correct behaviour, but getting back to Lord Vetinari, we also have our dark side, and is this tied in with intelligence? Martha Robbins of the Max Planck Institute has documented a number of cases of murder and post-mortem mutilation amongst wild bonobos. And these are meant to be the really happy, hippie, sort of free-love apes. And apparently they're not. Very, very disturbing cases of sexual jealousy. And similarly, incidents of gang rape have been documented amongst wild dolphins, the younger ones who are not getting any sort of gang up on one female. Now, in humans, this sort of behaviour would be considered criminal, and so where does this behaviour, especially amongst intelligent animals, because sure as hell we're not seeing much of that sort of thing amongst lower order animals. Is gratuitous violence and politically incorrect behaviour related to an excess of brain capacity? Because if it is, we've got some very serious issues to deal with when we're saying intelligence is always going to be a good thing. Okay, so chimps can display a range of human behaviours such as stone tools, using large leaves to protect themselves in rain, which is effectively a very primitive form of clothing. They display grief and anguish, like the females when their babies die. And apparently self-recognition, deception and degrees of self-awareness have been demonstrated by some researchers. Domesticated chimps can also learn to use sign language skills to communicate concepts to and from their keepers, which basically means that they're right on the threshold of speech. So viewed this way, we're suddenly not alone. Lots of intelligent animals behave just like us and even misbehave just like us. This raises the question of what might have already happened, of course, in the ways of, have other species reached the singularity boundary and actually stepped across it, and what we're seeing is the aftermath of that. So if the cephalopods did it 65 billion years ago, that's an awful long time for them just to have stayed at the same level. Maybe we can't recognise it. That could be a very important question for researchers to address. So we already have an extensive artificial environment ourselves that allows us to live in an early transhuman condition. We, in this room here, have access to communications, mobility, medical care, information and influence across the internet that even a head of state would have really loved to have a century ago. They certainly didn't have jetliners, they certainly didn't have thousands of Facebook friends, all that sort of thing. So feeding ourselves only takes a small fraction of the day, clothing takes even less. And many of us commute over distances that were once the journey of a lifetime for people in rural agricultural communities. Once upon a time we were thought of starting to get a bit old in our 30s, but today you can create offence by saying that people in their 60s are old. They say, oh, we're just sort of vaguely middle-aged, because we're extremely healthy, very, very well educated, very good medical care. And thus we're not subjected to the same stresses that aged people prematurely in the past. Not in mortality, but a very good shot at it. Take the newest medical condition now, which I have named Twitter brain, because it's really new and there's no name for it. People develop such a need for quick and easy emotional rewards from social networking and scanning the web and that sort of thing, that the brain structure is actually now biased towards quick hits. It's developing the same characteristics as drug addicts. Now stop and think about it. Mass social networking is 2004, somewhere around about then, it really started to take off. That makes it maybe 6 years old. We've only had the web effectively since 1994. We're already no longer the humans we used to be. And this changes virtually overnight. You've got to stop and think about that. It's already here. And so how far and how fast can this process go with humanity as a whole? Well, while many people are still subsistence farmers, they often have cheap mobile phones on very cheap plans. And they've at least got communal internet, if not individual internet, on a very cheap plan. Because this stuff doesn't require much in the way of funding to put it out to these people, so they can afford to drop the price in the poorer countries, and that's why a surprising number of them actually do have a degree of access to it. Now, some experiments have shown, I think it was earlier this year, or it might have been last year, that if Western society people, they use college students in the US, and they deprive them of their phones, internets, laptops and credit cards for 24 hours, and some of them were in serious trouble by the time the experiment finished. They were displaying all the signs of, like heavy drug withdrawal symptoms. So to put another way, humanity has different degrees of early transhuman, of an early transhuman situation right now. And it goes a bit beyond the internet, like our current society. I'm from the Weather Bureau, and one of the things we monitor is space weather. There's a thing called a Carrington event, which is a massive coronal mass ejection from the sun. Were that to hit the Earth, I would say that would be the end of civilization as we know it, and literally most of the population would die. Why is that? It's basically because it'll blow out our transformers. And transformers need electricity to be rebuilt, and if you've knocked out the electricity infrastructure, you're literally looking at about half a century to rebuild it. In the meantime, people are starving because we're so dependent on that for food distribution, for water pumping, for just about everything. So we're highly dependent on what we've built already. Let's take another thing. We've talked a bit about immortality. Well, prototype immortality is already with us. Currently, our electronic legacies can and do live on after death in things like Facebook and other web environments. And while these are just sort of like expressions of self, and they're not self-motivated or self-aware, they are a tentative step towards immortality. There's a movement in Russia for soldiers who have been bullied and have died as a result of bullying in the Russian army, and their relatives and other, I think there's an institute who runs it as well, actually run them as live people on Facebook talking about their experiences. And it's quite convincing. Now, once again, humans are running this, but you are effectively talking to the dead people, because what are the people reduced to? They're reduced to their Facebook profiles. And you'd say, well, I could talk to you as Adam if Adam just got shot when he walked out for dinner or something. And it wouldn't sound like Adam, but I'd probably be able to take over his Facebook profile and come across in a reasonably convincing fashion. And if this is all that practically anybody sees of Adam, then he's effectively still alive, as long as I keep up a good enough act. And yeah, once again, this is, as I said, prototype immortality, starting to experiment with the levels of what makes us look immortal. Very hard to reproduce yourself, but not all that hard to reproduce a subset that people take as you. If you see what I'm getting at, it's been simplified. And the simplification will continue. Okay, so machines with a degree of self-awareness may already be with us, but once again, like the octopus, in a form that we can't recognise. Large computer systems show the characteristics of life. Certainly the one we've got at work does. Okay, when shut down, some systems, and you go to a conference of computer people and they all say the same thing. Well, they better not, because it can't be restarted as the same machine. It can be restarted eventually, but so interrelated that you shut down one, or shut down the whole thing if you've got a fire drill or something, and it has to be brought up in a sequence that's totally dependent on everything else. And eventually, you get it going again, but it's no longer the same system. System administrators have died or moved on to other jobs. Nobody understands the code, so bits of it get rewritten. You literally don't get the same machine back. So is this reincarnation after death? Well, it certainly looks like it to me. Many systems, as I said, evolve over the years, different administrators. They're just but most importantly, they're too complex to be entirely understood. Okay, so might there be, because we can't even understand how they're entirely working entirely anymore, might there also be a degree of self-awareness, but not the same as we as humans understand as self-awareness. We can't comprehend it, but does that mean it's not there? Okay, so that's another thing to think about. Bionic human-computer interfaces are already in the early stages of experimentation. Thought can already be used to command computers to perform simple tasks in the scientific literature. Brain scans can also be used to read thoughts at a very, very rudimentary level. I think there was a New Scientist article a couple of weeks ago on that. Is an advanced human-computer interface practical? Well, there are biological problems. The refresh rate of the human brain, I think about as fast as it goes, is about 26 times a second. It varies a bit, but it doesn't go much beyond that. Otherwise we'd have trouble watching movies. So the computer clock speeds are sort of closing in on about 1 million times faster than that. And if you've got parallel processors, a large number of them, because the brain is exhibits a lot of properties of parallel processing as well. You've got the computer totally outclassing what we can do with our 26 cycles per second brain. Okay, so what will this do when you've got a human-computer relationship? Well, the weak link is going to be the human. So the human brain can't be speeded up. Genetic engineering, well, it doesn't work that way. The nerve impulses travel at somewhere between 200 and 300 kilometres per hour, I believe. And the computer, and like one of the things we do at karate is I hold my hands up and we get somebody with a gun that goes click. And if they're about that far away, I can move faster than they can pull the trigger. I've done this many times over the last 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is. Nobody has ever pulled the trigger faster than I can knock the gun away and actually grab them by the throat. Because the human brain doesn't work sufficiently fast. Reactions don't travel up and down neural pathways sufficiently fast for people to react that fast. A robot could, what's his name? Terminator, Arnie probably could because he's presumably all electronically wired. Okay, this is the heart of the problem between human and computer interfaces. So I'd say the best thing we could do is to actually use the computer as a resource, almost like a peer, to actually help with things that we can't do, and hopefully there are some things that we can do that the computers can't. And so we'll have a relationship, but I can't actually see a real merging of the biological human and the computer. Okay, so let's pause here for a second. What defines us? Well, I've mentioned him earlier. This medieval Scottish philosopher Duns Scotus said that if one separates the soul from the body, as the Catholic Church thought of as the soul, then the identity remains with the soul, and the bishops were all fairly happy with that. And then he said, if you then separate the memories from the soul, where's the person? And there were a lot of ulcers in very high theological places when he said that, because very hard to tell the soul is the person. Well, actually, you take his memories away and there's nothing there, because you're made up of the experience of your life. What are the memories? Well, even in the Middle Ages, it seemed that data rather than body was actually seen as defining the individual. If one has the data, then data can be downloaded, transferred, stored, or archived. Now we go to three alternatives for the human-computer interface, and that is we can do a full download of the human brain, and theoretically possible, but it's bloody hard, because once again there's a lot of computer architectural problems we don't even understand in the brain. A lot of parallel operations go on, the hormonal influences that we don't even begin to understand yet. Probably do it, but it would take an immense amount of processing power, but we'd probably get there eventually. I don't think there's any theoretical reason that it can't work. Second is for a computer to be raised as a human, and this was explored in the Bicentennial Man with Robin Williams, where a domestic robot accumulates human experience to the point where he actually is effectively human. So I think this is also possible in theory, and currently there are some processes which can actually mimic human interactions in certain very well-defined situations quite effectively. But not, you couldn't actually replace Adam with a computer and actually be convinced, not at this stage anyway. The third is for computers to go their own way and develop their own style of self-awareness and intelligence. One presumes that both humans and computers could bring something constructive to the relationship, but humans will always remain largely as they are now, and I'm about to go into some science fiction representations of that, because Arthur C. Clarke did a very good one back in the 40s. So even with genetic engineering, you can basically, remember the speed of the impulse, the nerve impulses, can't be speeded up, not unless we replace all the nerves with wires. Okay, and once we're within the brain, hey, look, if you're going to replace the brain synapses and such with wires, well, why bother in the first place? You might as well, use the computer. Back to the other alternative. So the World Wide Web came into being about 1994, grew with astonishing rapidity. After that, I wrote an article in 1997 called Self-Sculpting on the Internet. It's published in a fantastic Self, an anthology of essays on this. And in this I pointed out that people were already starting to develop personas on social chat sites. I don't know if you remember MUDs and things like that, but they did exist long ago, that were actually operating at the time. I predicted that this trend would become more popular and that these avatars would become people's preferred personas. As you're born a little bit short or a bit too tall, fine, we can make somebody who's intermediate height and you'd be that person. Now, you know, you're tired of growing old, well, you just make a younger avatar, and as long as you're alive and reasonably compass, you can be that younger person until you die. That is the value of that sort of having that sort of identity. So now we're seeing other trends, such as diminished attention spans amongst heavy internet users, and the inability to be deprived of social media for more than a few minutes. Like my daughter is always checking up on stuff as she's, you know, in the conferences and that sort of thing. Most of her friends are doing exactly the same. You know, they've always got the iPhone out and that sort of thing. And I can't be too self-righteous about this, because when I'm at a conference with my daughter, I actually get her to do stuff for me, even though I don't have an iPhone. So I'm sort of depending on this a bit myself. I lost my place. So, and a tendency to live within virtual worlds in the real world. Like I'm sure you all know people who have lived in the world of Warcraft for, you know, like almost years on end in some cases. Sort of a couple of smiles in the audience, so I won't point to them. So all of us have a degree of dependence on the internet. And if you doubt it, just try and imagine just killing it off completely and seeing how we get along without it. We won't. Now you're already a bit transhuman at this very moment, but you're probably, you know, worried about looking uncool or really letting yourself go. If you really let yourself go, there's already a lot of resources that could actually have us looking very differently. So let's have a look at computers and computer networks. First, shutting them down is nothing short of extreme trauma or open heart surgery if it was a biological thing like me. Okay, so people, other computers, financial systems, and a whole raft of dependencies are hanging off large computer systems. Yes, you actually can shut them down, but ultimately you can also get a gun and shoot a human. And would you do it? Well, you wouldn't shoot a human, one hopes anyway. Why not? Well, you'd kill a sheep because you want a lamb chop. You'd kill a cow because you want leather shoes. Why wouldn't you kill a computer? Well, because humans are already in symbiosis with it, so part of us is in that computer. We can't afford to kill it now, at this very moment. Remember, the title of this is doing it now. Computer-human relationship has already become a bit transhuman. It exists and is in operation now, and computer welfare is human welfare. Computers are us. Computer system is alive, and it's become part of the human experience, in a very broad sense. At this point, it displays some characteristics of life, but does it also display self-awareness and other characteristics of intelligence? If we're really concerned with transhumanism, I'd say that the question should be, does intelligence matter? Does computer self-awareness matter? Because it's not going to be the same as ours. Neither is intelligence nor is it self-awareness. It'll be very good exercise to try and work out what machine values are, rather than say, can we get a machine to have our values? I think we're looking at the question the wrong way around. Okay, now, alternatives to intelligence. Science fiction has a few things to say here. In 1982, Bruce Sterling's The Swarm was published. This concerns a species of insect-like aliens that live in asteroids and burrow into them like termites, which they're modelled on. And they become living spacecraft and fly off into space to find other asteroids when it becomes time to swarm, hence the title. When a human expedition enters one of these asteroids, these hives, it's ignored at first, but then eventually they discover an alien that can talk to them. And it tells them that the swarm has actually bred it specifically to talk to them. and that sometime in the very distant past it experimented with intelligence and found it was vastly overrated and didn't bother. So humans discovered that the swarm has actually tried human intelligence but found it not useful. Its longevity, its survivability, its adaptability, that's more important to the swarm. So the humans are faced with the idea that humanity's crowning glory, its intelligence, is just one of many survival strategies, and possibly not the best one. In my own story, Walk to the Full Moon, published about 10 years ago, had a similar theme. A living female example of Homo heidelbergensis, which is the ancestor of the Neanderthal man, is discovered in southern Spain. And these particular hominids have a very large hindbrain and usual sloping forehead. And that's where a lot of the motor control comes from. So my idea was that they actually had better mobility than humans. Better mobility in the form that they could actually move forward through time. It's a survival skill. You're having a bad winter, go forward to the next spring. A saber-toothed tiger's chasing you, well, just go forward to the next day, it won't be there. And they weren't all that intelligent, they were able to communicate up to a point, but basically they were just moving through the 20th or the 21st century, and one of them happened to get mixed up with the scientific team, and she was examined and tested. So as a survival strategy, it's possibly a viable alternative to intelligence. So I tried a different approach with Mother of Champions, with all the cat lovers love, because here cheetahs have developed a very outre form of intelligence. They're perfect, being the fastest self-propelled animals ever. And this doesn't include birds that can actually dive. They're using gravity, they're cheating. Cheetahs are basically perfection in terms of using muscles, bones and body to actually move across. They can reach about 70 miles an hour, bloody fast. So humans, well-intended, and they're having survival problems because lions and wild dogs and that sort of thing steal their food, kill their cubs, that sort of stuff. So some humans intervene to give them some social skills so that they act in packs to drive off lions and do various things. And at the end of the story, the cheetahs get together to kill off the intervening humans and then to kill off the genetically modified cheetahs. Why? Because they're perfect. Because being kept on the very brink actually keeps them sharp and perfect, and they become, by turning them into pack animals, they're no longer so dependent on speed. And their singularity is being perfect. And their value system, now, people have looked at this, oh, there's something wrong with this, they should have liked being more intelligent. But no, that's not their value system. And it's very hard for people to get around another value system. We love being intelligent, and we can't give it up, it's like a drug. Okay, so best singularity I've seen, and this is not a story by me, is Arthur C. Clarke's Second Dawn, which I think, does anyone know Arthur C. Clarke? 1948, I think he wrote this, quite a while back anyway, in which there is a real singularity event. A species of equine aliens, like they've got a single leg, and two tiny little forepaws like a tyrannosaurus, and a unicorn horn. So they're very, very limited in a physical sense, a bit like dolphins. So they have no effective control of the natural world, so they develop extremely advanced mental and mind control skills. And one nation, I suppose you can say, develops a really apocalyptic mind weapon, which literally wipes the minds clean of an entire rival nation. So the Athalenti actually wipes the minds of the Mithranians, and the victors suddenly realise that they develop powers that will eventually destroy their species. There's a huge crisis of conscience. They've literally got millions of completely spaced out enemies that they now have to look after morally and drive around and feed, because their minds are gone and they're so overcome by conscience of what they've actually done to their neighbouring nation. Now, they also raise the point that now that they develop such, it's like thermonuclear weapons or even worse, that now that they've got this technology, they're sure to use it on each other. And it's going to get worse and they're going to wipe themselves out. At this point, one of the philosophers discovers a small hominid species on an island called the Felini. And he teaches them to use their hands to build tools and instruments. And one of them, and he actually tells that when he's making the announcement, he said, once I found a field of flowers and I wanted to see what was inside the flowers. And I tried to pull them apart and use my teeth, and I couldn't. And I got so frustrated I jumped up and down on the patch and trod them all into the earth. Now, with the small ones, with these little monkey things, they actually picked the flower apart and he could see what was inside for the first time. The hominoids allow the equids to move away from the very destructive mind sciences and into physical investigations of the natural world to build tools. One of them has got a smashed horn from the war, and the little hominids actually build him a horn out of very hard wood and screw it onto his head so that he's again whole. He's the sort of Prime Minister, I think. I haven't read the story for a while, and that sort of is a big hit as far as he's concerned. So the story is written in the 1940s, but could easily be a very good allegory for what we're talking about now, which is human and computer interfacing. The Felini, who are very good with their hands, and the equids, I suppose. There's no real name for the collective species, which are very good with their brains. Not an exact parallel, but a pretty good one for humans and computers. Both of us bring something to it. And if you look at it this way, then we don't need all that much in the way of modification to actually go past the singularity. We can do it much as we are now without having to merge with machines. So it's an allegorical story, but it's still a very good one. Arthur C. Clarke's a pretty bright guy. Well, he was, he's dead now. So instead of intelligence, science fiction offers us perfection, temporal mobility, survivability, a whole host of other things apart from intelligence. The natural world already has various things like survivability, and survivability is used extensively, like bacteria, termites, a whole lot of other things have actually survived and flourished for hundreds of millions of years. Conversely, hominids have a rather bad record of survival. I think we've documented about 24 species of quite intelligent hominids over the past 2 or 3 million years. They were all extinct, and a lot of them weren't in direct competition with humans. So not a good record for intelligent hominids surviving. Even in the last 30,000 years, all species of hominid except us have vanished into oblivion, and there were several. I haven't been able to do all the research, but Homo neanderthalis, Homo ergaster, that's quite an early hominid which is believed to have survived in Java till about 20,000 years ago. Certainly Homo florensis, it is the hobbit man, it's about so tall. And the newly discovered species, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, the Deniscians, they're not given a Homo prefix, but they're about the same level as Neanderthals. Now, if I were forced to take a position, I'd say that symbiosis between humans and computers is inevitable, and that it's a good thing that this process has already begun, because we're fairly frail as a species. And I think we'll, rather like the equids in Arthur C. Clarke's story, we actually need something that's going to protect us against our inherent ability to fall apart. Okay, so current relationship between human and computers is not all that good at the present time, however. Like, there's organised crime, disorganised crime, terrorism, sexual predation, bullying, stalking, aggressive religious proselytism, political extremism, all flourishing on the internet. So human frailties are here, clearly at work. But can humans and computers together moderate this sort of behaviour if the whole process is taken a bit further? Well, a lot of the crimes listed above are culturally based, and clearly a change in culture means a change in human outlook so that these sort of things don't happen. It's nothing to do with humans. So what else can modify human outlook? the process is going on, whether we like it or not. Will it modify our outlook? Because if it doesn't, all of those very destructive predilections are still in there. Okay, so I don't know what the story is. I don't know where it's going. I'm just saying it is happening right now, and it's not something we're going to legislate against. So where does that leave us relative to that passage already at the start? We aren't going to give it up. In my 1999 novel, Souls and the Great Machine, I had a future Australia ruled by a caste of psychopathic librarians, which could be a tautology, I suppose. And they're using a human-powered computer. There's sort of like 2,000 slaves chained up in the basement with abacus beads. And I actually simulated this on, if any of you are into archaeology, VAX 11780 in Pascal. And it works. It's fairly slow, but I made a parallel operating system, and it's, I built in all the timings, and it works. I invented my own programming language. I wrote a couple of programs, did an operating system. It wouldn't have been too bad, and it's actually been my bestseller so far, actually. Now, at a stage late in the, I think it's in the late in this book, some do-gooders supposedly actually try to liberate the computer, and they take off the chains and, okay, guys, you can all go home. Well, we don't want to go. We've actually got positions. We've got roles. I'm a senior function class 2. I'm not going to leave. I'd just be cutting wood if I left here. And they go back inside. There's no chains anymore, but the society has become a bit dependent on that calculator, because people are trying to sabotage it by liberating the components. But the components like being part of the machine. They've got roles in there, the same way as we've got roles on the internet and in Facebook. So they don't go. Once again, primitive transhumanism it might be, but it's still transhumanism. So to conclude again, think back to Lord Vetinari and the capacity for bad behaviour amongst humans. Singularity happens around maybe 2021, 100 years, 3 generations from the S11 attacks. And I'm very sensitive on the subject. I was in a United Airlines plane when they took place. When we landed, oh boy, well, I was not happy. So, I mean, my daughter went into school when we landed in Melbourne, and she went along to Wesley, and they were having a prayer meeting for her. She actually turned up, so highly emotional for me. But once again, remember, if we have a singularity in a century from then, that's 3 generations away from something as horrendous as that. That's giving an awful lot of power to people who are actually running or even merging with these systems. Can they be trusted? Not to go into all those other very nasty agendas that I've just listed. Okay, all of this is going to happen, whether we try to legislate against it or we don't. And as a parallel, if we couldn't do anything about the global financial crisis, is it going to be any better for the singularity? I tend to suggest no. We have to start making, I don't have the solution, but I'd say we have to start making people aware of what they're putting together, the same way as people are now aware of what they put together when they let bonds and derivatives and executives on very high salary bonuses actually start running our pension funds and determining the cost of our real estate. With that warning, that's it. Any questions, or what do we do?
We've got time for a couple of questions, and we've got a panel.
Do you want this thing back?
Yeah, just place it on the table. Yeah, thanks. That was a really good talk. We're going to have had some questions. Okay, anybody got a question?
I just wondered what the book was Arthur C. Clarke wrote.
It wasn't a book, it was a collection of short stories. It's called Second Dawn. And one of the anthologies it was in was called Expedition to Earth.
Thank you.
Nice. How about let's go to the panel, and then we can start the question process there.